All right, so we are here to talk about something that can really make or break a construction project.
Yeah.
The final account. You
Yes.
know, that moment when everything is wrapping up,
Right.
all the dust is settled, all the invoices are starting to come in,
Yes.
and everybody is holding their breath to see if the numbers actually,
Flyer.
line up.
Yeah, it's definitely a critical stage. And I think a lot of times it's where you see tensions can run pretty high.
Right.
Getting this right is really essential for both sides, the
Yeah.
employer and the contractor, making sure that there's a smooth closeout. That's fair.
Absolutely. And we've got a roadmap today to guide us through this potential minefield.
Okay.
We are doing a deep dive into the RICS Practice Information Final Account Procedures.
Okay.
This was published in December 2015 and was effective as of March 2016.
Great. And this is a really great source of information,
Yeah.
especially when you get into the intersection of contracts and final accounts.
That's right. And that's actually what we're going to focus on today.
Okay.
How these different contract types in particular,
Yeah.
we're going to be talking about JCT and NEC
Okay.
and how they impact this whole process of the final account.
Great.
Because the fine print can make a huge difference when it comes to these settlements.
Absolutely. And I think, really understanding those nuances
Yeah.
can really be a key to preventing disputes
Right.
and making sure everybody feels good at the end of the day.
Okay.
Like they got what they deserved.
Yes. So before we get lost in the weeds
Right.
of those specific clauses,
Yeah.
let's take a step back
Okay.
and clarify what a final account even is.
All right.
Because it's more than just the final payment, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Think of it as a really comprehensive, reckoning of all the financial ins and outs of the project.
Right.
We're talking the original contract sum, any adjustments for variations,
Okay.
fluctuations in material prices, loss and expense claims, like the whole 9 yards.
Okay. So basically making sure every penny is accounted for.
Yeah. Yep.
And that final payment really reflects what actually happened,
Yes.
not just what was envisioned in that initial contract.
Precisely. And, that's where things can get interesting, especially when you factor in the specific provisions of the contract that are governing that final account process.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about contract types.
Okay.
The RICS guidance highlights both JCT and NEC contracts.
Right?
These are, kind of the bread and butter of the UK construction industry.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So how do they actually approach final accounts differently?
So JCT contracts being more of that traditional contract,
Okay.
they kind of lay out a very specific procedure
Okay.
and a rigid set of timelines for, submitting, reviewing, and agreeing to the final account.
Right.
It's a little bit more like a structured dance where each party takes their turn at the appropriate moment.
Okay. And while that sounds very organized,
Yeah.
I can imagine that could also lead to some bottlenecks, especially if things haven't been diligently documented throughout the project.
Yeah. Yeah, you're spot on. If those changes haven't been meticulously tracked,
Right.
you can really end up with a mountain of paperwork and disagreements when you get to that final account stage.
Right. Which brings us to NEC,
Okay.
often touted as the more collaborative contract form.
Right.
So they have this whole concept of rolling final accounts.
Yes.
So what's the deal with that?
With NEC, it's really about continuous assessment and agreement. So
Uh-huh.
imagine it's like a series of mini settlements that happen throughout the entire project lifecycle.
Okay.
So rather than having one big bang at the end,
Right.
you're constantly adjusting that contract sum as you go for the variations and the changes.
So in theory, this should make that final account process a lot less stressful.
In theory, yes. If everybody is diligently updating their costs
Right.
and agreeing to variations as they occur, then you
Yeah.
should ideally end up with a final account that's really just more of a formality than a battleground.
Right. But let's be honest. Construction projects never go exactly according to plan.
Of course not.
So do these rolling final accounts actually work that smoothly in practice?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Even with the best intentions.
Yeah.
And that collaborative contract. The reality on site can be a very different story. You're always going to have unforeseen issues. Deadlines are going to shift.
Right.
Sometimes those agreements on variations just don't happen as smoothly as you envision.
Right. Which means even with NEC contracts, that final account meeting can still be a little bit tense.
It certainly can.
Yeah.
But that's where I think, this RICS guidance really comes in handy.
Okay.
Because it gives you a lot of really practical tips
Right.
on how to manage those ongoing assessments.
Okay.
How to make sure everything is documented.
Right.
And crucially, to make sure you have good communication throughout the whole project.
So it's about using the contract as a tool to collaborate.
Yes.
but also recognizing that, human factors, unforeseen circumstances can always throw a wrench in even the best laid plans.
Exactly. And I think just being aware of those potential pitfalls
Right.
is really half the battle.
Okay, so we've kind of established that these different contracts,
Right.
Bring different sort of flavors to the final account party.
Yes.
So I'm curious to hear some specific examples of how these contractual nuances actually play out
Okay.
in real life. So let's say we're dealing with a variation, that inevitable thing that always comes up in a project.
Right.
How would a JCT contract handle that compared to an NEC contract?
So under a JCT, the process is fairly formal.
Okay.
So typically the contractor would have to submit a really detailed notice of the variation that's going to outline the scope, the cost, the time impact. And then from there, the architect or the contract administrator would have to formally instruct the variation.
So there's lots of paperwork, lots of approvals going back and forth.
A lot of back and forth.
Yeah. And what about under the NEC? Would it be a more streamlined process?
It could be potentially, yes. Because NEC has this concept of compensation events,
Right.
which essentially encompasses any event that might affect the cost or the completion date of the project.
Okay.
So that includes variations.
It's a much broader category.
Right. It's much broader. And what NEC really encourages is early warnings about these compensation events.
Okay.
So if the contractor identifies a potential variation, they're supposed to notify the project manager promptly.
Right.
And that allows for a quicker assessment and agreement on the cost and time adjustments.
So ideally, you're catching these things before they turn into huge problems down the road?
That's the goal.
Okay.
Right.
Right, because as we discussed, reality doesn't always reflect that.
Exactly.
So it's not just about picking the right contract.
Right.
It's about understanding the nuances of each.
Yeah.
And applying them proactively throughout the entire life of the project.
Absolutely. And that's, where I think having a really solid grasp of this RICS guidance can be a real game changer.
And speaking of the guidance, it doesn't just focus on JCT and NEC.
Yeah.
It also goes into other aspects that impact final accounts, like record keeping and dispute resolution.
For sure. And we're going to explore those a little bit more in the coming parts of this deep dive. So
Great. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of final accounts.
Yeah.
And contract law. We've already, sort of explored how those different contracts like JCT and NEC can really shape this process.
Right. And we also talked about how important it is to, be really proactive with contract management, make sure communication is good.
Yeah.
And those records are meticulous.
Yeah.
Especially with those variations.
Yeah, those pesky variations.
Yeah, always coming up.
Right. So let's actually roll up our sleeves and get into the, the nitty-gritty of how these contractual nuances actually play out in the preparation of a final account.
Okay.
So let's imagine we're sitting in the quantity surveyor's office, surrounded by stacks of documents. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think the first step is to gather all the essential pieces of that, financial puzzle.
Okay.
So that's going to include the original contract, of course, but then every change or every record of variations.
Okay.
Payment certificates, cost reports, anything and everything that can paint a complete picture of the journey.
It's like forensic accounting.
Yes.
For construction.
It really is.
You're piecing together the financial story of what happened on site.
That's a great way to put it. And just like a forensic accountant, the quantity surveyor needs to be so meticulous to make sure that every transaction, every adjustment is properly documented, supported.
Okay, now we talked earlier about how, NEC contracts really emphasize this concept of rolling final accounts.
Yes.
Does that change the game when it comes to actually, preparing the final account document?
It definitely influences the approach.
Okay.
With those rolling final accounts, the quantity surveyor is essentially keeping a running tally throughout the whole project. So
it's not just this mad scramble at the end.
Exactly.
To try to reconcile everything.
You're doing it as you go.
Okay.
And regularly incorporating those adjustments that you've already agreed to.
So it's much more of an iterative process.
Right, it is.
As the project evolves.
Absolutely. And while this can definitely make the final account preparation a bit less overwhelming, it still requires a lot of diligence.
Right.
The quantity surveyor needs to make sure all those agreed upon changes are properly reflected in that final document.
Okay, and I imagine those specific contract clauses related to variations in compensation events really come into play here.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
They need to be very well versed in the contract provisions to make sure the final account is prepared in accordance with those obligations.
So it's not just about crunching numbers, it's understanding the legal framework.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's where that RICS guidance really shines. It's not just general advice, it's getting into those really nuanced details.
Okay, so let's say we've meticulously prepared our, final account document. We've checked all the numbers, it aligns with the contract.
Right.
What happens next?
Right, well then it's showtime.
Okay.
You got to go to those final account meetings where the quantity surveyor will present the findings to the contractor and the employer.
And I imagine those meetings can be a little bit tense.
Yeah, there's definitely some negotiation.
Right.
But it shouldn't be adversarial.
Okay.
Ideally, it's a collaborative process.
Right.
Where everyone's working toward a fair and accurate settlement.
But disagreements are bound to happen.
Oh, of course.
So what are some of the common sticking points?
Well, as you might expect, money is often at the heart of it.
Right.
The contractor might dispute the valuation of some variations, arguing that they were more complex or time-consuming than originally anticipated.
Okay.
And the employer, on the other hand, might question the necessity of certain costs.
Right.
Or, the validity of a loss and expense claim.
So it's really trying to find that sweet spot.
It is.
Where both parties feel like they're getting a fair deal.
Right.
But what happens if those disagreements can't be resolved?
Right.
Over a cup of coffee?
Well, that's where the RICS guidance is so helpful.
Okay.
Because it provides a roadmap.
Okay.
For dispute resolution.
Okay.
So it outlines this escalation ladder.
Right.
That starts with negotiation.
Right.
If that fails, you might consider mediation.
Okay.
Where a neutral third party comes in to try to find some common ground.
Okay, and if even mediation doesn't work?
Well, then things might escalate to those more formal and legally binding processes, like adjudication, or in some cases, even litigation.
Right.
But those are generally seen as a last resort.
Right.
And they can be very costly and time-consuming.
So it's really in everybody's best interest to try to settle things.
Absolutely.
Amicably.
The earlier, the better.
Right.
And the RICS guidance emphasizes that, preventing disputes should be the primary goal. That's why that clear communication, that thorough documentation, and that collaborative approach are so crucial throughout the whole project lifecycle.
So it's not just about knowing the rules of the game.
Right.
It's about playing the game strategically to avoid those costly battles.
It is, and that's where I think, understanding those nuances of the contract and applying that practical advice from the RICS guidance can give you a real advantage.
Okay, so we've talked about, kind of that general process of preparing and negotiating the final account.
Yes.
But the RICS guidance also gets into some really specific scenarios and potential complications.
Right.
So I'm curious about a few of those.
Okay.
For instance, what happens if the contractor includes items in their claim that weren't actually formally instructed?
Right.
Those, I thought it was implied situations.
Right. Those can be tricky.
Yeah, they can really throw a wrench in the works.
They can, and that's where the RICS guidance stresses how important it is to have really crystal clear contract administration.
Right.
If there's any ambiguity about whether something was actually instructed, you have to address it formally and promptly rather than letting it fester and potentially become this huge dispute.
Right. So be proactive and nip those disagreements.
Exactly. And again, it reinforces the need to document everything.
Yeah.
If the contractor believes that something was implied, they should put it in writing.
Okay.
Seek clarification.
Right.
Get those instructions formally documented.
Okay, now we've been focusing a lot on JCT and NEEC.
Right.
But what about those situations where a project is governed by a bespoke or amended contract?
Yeah.
Does the RICS guidance offer any insight there?
It does, and it really emphasizes that you need to be extra vigilant. Mm-hmm. When you're dealing with those non-standard contracts, you have to carefully review those specific clauses related to final accounts, variations, dispute resolution, because they could deviate significantly from those standard forms.
So it's even more important to have a legal expert on hand.
Absolutely.
To really decipher.
That's where a quantity surveyor with that expertise can really be a lifesaver.
Right. They can help you navigate all that.
Right.
Okay, now speaking of protection.
Yes.
The RICS guidance also offers some really valuable advice
Yeah,
on negotiation strategies.
it does.
And it really emphasizes that negotiation should always be the first step
Absolutely.
in resolving these disputes.
Yes. And it encourages a collaborative approach.
Okay.
Where both parties are coming to the table,
Right.
with a clear understanding of their goals and a willingness to try to find some mutually acceptable solutions.
So it's more than just haggling over numbers. It's about finding that win-win.
It really is.
Right.
And the guidance suggests focusing on interests
Okay.
rather than positions.
What does that mean?
So a position is what you say you want.
Okay.
So, the contractor might say, hey, I want an additional £10,000 for this variation.
Okay.
But the interest is the underlying reason
Okay.
why they want that money.
Okay.
Maybe it's because they incurred all these unforeseen costs
Right.
because of a change in the site conditions.
Okay, so if you understand each other's interests, then you can maybe find more creative solutions.
Absolutely.
To the problem.
Exactly. And the guidance provides some really helpful tips
Okay.
on how to identify those interests, how to communicate effectively, and really how to build that rapport
Right.
during those negotiations.
Now, earlier we talked about how NEC contracts encourage those early warnings
Yes.
about potential issues that could affect, cost or completion date.
Right.
Does the RICS guidance talk about how those early warnings should be handled?
It does, and it points out that you need to take those early warnings very seriously
Right.
and address them promptly.
Right.
And it also suggests documenting them thoroughly.
Okay.
So you want to include, what the issue is,
Okay.
what the potential impact is,
Right.
and then what your proposed solutions are.
So it's not just, waving a red flag.
Right.
It's about having a constructive conversation.
Exactly. It's about trying to mitigate those problems before they get out of control.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From, preparing the final account,
Right.
negotiating it,
Yes.
dispute resolution.
Yep.
We talked about uninstructed items,
Bespoke contracts.
bespoke contracts, yeah.
Early warnings.
Early warnings.
In those NEC contracts.
Okay. But there's still more to uncover.
There is.
In the final part of this deep dive, we're going to examine some additional considerations,
Okay.
including the role of auditing in ensuring accuracy and compliance.
Okay.
The VAT implications that can really trip up even the most seasoned professionals.
Yeah.
And the concept of notional final accounts,
Right.
which come into play when a contractor goes into liquidation. So, stay tuned. Welcome back to, the final part of our deep dive
All right.
into RICS final account procedures. We've been on this journey.
We have.
We've looked at the preparation,
Yeah.
the negotiations,
Right.
the potential pitfalls,
Yes.
all with that, keen eye on contract law.
For sure.
We've even climbed that escalation ladder of dispute resolution,
You've climbed it.
armed with negotiation strategies
Yes.
and a collaborative mindset. So
Yes.
hopefully you're feeling well equipped
I
to tackle those final account meetings.
Right.
But before we sign off on this project,
Yes.
we've got a few more items to check off our list.
Okay.
Think of it as the final walkthrough,
Right.
making sure every detail is accounted for and in order.
Yeah, just like a thorough inspection. We need to make sure that, that final account is accurate,
Yeah.
compliant, and reflects what actually happened.
Okay, so first up on our checklist, auditing.
Okay.
Now, I know the word audit can be a little scary,
Right.
but the RICS guidance emphasizes that it's an absolutely vital part of this process.
It is.
And not just about, catching errors.
Right. So much more than that,
Right.
Think of it as that final quality control check,
Okay.
making sure there's consistency, accuracy, compliance
Right.
with the contract.
Right.
With any relevant accounting standards, it's really about peace of mind,
Okay.
knowing that everything is, above board and properly documented.
So it's a safeguard.
Yeah.
For both sides.
Absolutely.
Protecting their interests.
Yep,
Minimizing that risk of future disputes.
for sure.
Does the guidance offer any specifics on how to actually conduct
It does.
an effective audit? What should we be looking for?
It suggests that, you develop a really comprehensive checklist, a roadmap to make sure you've covered all the bases.
Okay.
So this might include, verifying the accuracy of your measurements, calculations, making sure that all your variations and change orders were
Right.
properly authorized,
Oh, wait.
ensuring compliance with those VAT regulations,
Okay.
and meticulously reviewing the
Yeah.
supporting documentation
Yeah.
for every single cost.
So meticulous but essential.
It is.
to make sure it's accurate.
Absolutely.
And this audit should be done both internally and externally.
Yes. The guidance recommends that two-pronged approach.
Okay.
So an internal audit, conducted by someone within the organization,
Right.
provides that first layer of scrutiny.
Okay.
And then an external audit conducted by an independent third party
Right.
brings that fresh perspective and that extra level of accountability.
So like a second set of eyes,
Exactly.
just to catch anything that might have been missed.
That's right. And that peace of mind is so valuable.
Right. Okay, speaking of complexities, let's talk about something that can make anyone's head spin.
Okay.
VAT.
Yeah. VAT.
Now, I know we can't get into the depths of tax law here,
Right.
but does the RICS guidance offer any pointers
It does.
on how VAT applies to final accounts?
It touches on some crucial considerations.
Okay.
And I think the key takeaway is that VAT really needs to be woven into the fabric of the project
Right.
from the very beginning,
Okay.
not just something you tack on at the end.
Right. So be VAT conscious.
Yes, throughout the entire project lifecycle.
Right.
So, factor it into those cost estimates,
Okay.
variations,
Okay.
payment certificates,
Right.
like every stage.
And I would imagine variations are particularly tricky.
Oh, they can be. One common pitfall is, determining whether a variation falls under the same VA treatment as the original contract
Right.
or requires a different approach.
Okay. And getting that wrong could have a huge impact
It could.
on the final numbers.
Absolutely.
So probably wise to seek expert advice from a VAT specialist?
Without a doubt, those VAT regulations can be incredibly intricate.
Right.
So it's always best to err on the side of caution.
Right. Okay. VAT check.
Check.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on a scenario
Okay.
that thankfully isn't super common,
Right.
but it can be really challenging, and that's notional final accounts.
Right.
So the guidance mentions this in situations where a contractor goes into liquidation.
Right. In those unfortunate situations,
Yeah.
the project comes to a screeching halt.
Right.
You've got all this unfinished work,
Right.
unsettled finances.
Okay.
So that's where those notional final accounts come in.
So it's a way to try to bring some closure,
It is.
even when the project hasn't reached completion.
Exactly. It's a way to estimate the value of the work that's been done.
Right.
And the costs incurred up to the point, when the contractor ceased trading.
Okay.
It can be a very complex process.
Yeah.
Often requiring, legal and insolvency professionals to come in to make sure that everyone's rights are protected
Cool.
and that you can reach a fair settlement.
Right. So challenging,
Yeah.
but highlights that need
It does.
to have that, really robust process in place.
Absolutely. And the RICS guidance provides such a valuable framework
Yeah.
for navigating those complexities.
Yeah.
Ensuring that even when you're facing adversity,
Yeah.
that final account process is handled fairly and professionally.
Well, this deep dive has been so insightful.
It has.
We've explored this intricate world
We have.
of the RICS final account procedures.
Yes.
From the initial prep
Right.
to the final audit.
Yep.
We've talked about so many different scenarios and potential challenges.
That's challenges.
And hopefully you, our listener, are walking away
Yeah.
with a new appreciation
They're fully.
for just how complex this is,
Right.
but with a solid grasp of the key principles
Yes.
and the knowledge to navigate it.
Absolutely. Remember, thorough preparation,
Right.
clear communication,
Yep.
and a proactive approach to problem solving. Right.
Are your best tools.
Excellent advice. And if you ever find yourself wading through a final account,
Yes.
remember that expert guidance from a quantity surveyor can really make all the difference.
They can.
They are your trusted advisors,
Absolutely.
equipped to navigate all those complexities
Yeah.
of contracts and costs.
Yes.
And those variations
For
that can help you understand your rights, your obligations.
Absolutely.
The best course of action
Right.
to reach a fair final account settlement.
To make sure that project closes out smoothly.
That brings us to the end of our deep dive
All right.
into the RICS final account procedures.
It's been a journey.
Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Remember, knowledge is power,
It is.
especially when it comes to construction finances.
Absolutely.
Until next time.
See that.